Okay, I think we're going to start getting things started here. We're going to be letting more people in. So if we can go to our first slide here. Want to welcome everyone to the PA Inclusion Collective's three-part series, From Barriers to Belonging, The Power of Peers in Inclusive Schools. This is our first session. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. Tonight's session and the rest of the series will be recorded. You'll get access to the recordings via email from PEAL's training team. Closed captioning is available for all sessions. The live chat function is enabled, as some of you have already discovered. Please use it. We invite you to use the chat during the presentation to interact with your fellow audience members and Erik Carter, who is joining us live. I will ask audience questions tonight after the presentation. So please use the chat feature and the Q&A if you like for your questions. Erik may answer some of your questions as he's presenting, but if he doesn't get to your question, we'll try to get to them at the end. I've also prepared some questions for Erik, so please stick around for the end. It's going to be really a good conversation. If you have any issues throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A so we can respond. If we have any technology issues and get disconnected for any reason, please log back in with the same Zoom link within a few minutes or check email after 5 minutes for an update. We want to thank the PEAL Center for their support in making this event possible. And now I will pass things over to Cindy Duke, the Interim Executive Director at the PEAL Center. And Cindy, I may have said your last name wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong. I apologize. I just know you as Cindy.
It's 4 letters, but it's like next to impossible to say. It's Cindy Ditch. So I wanted to say how excited we are and just thrilled to be again partnering with the PA Inclusion Collective. This is getting to be a regular thing, and we like it. So wanted to share first a little about the PEAL Center and the mission of the PEAL Center. PEAL Center, Parent Education Advocacy Leadership, mission is to educate and empower families to ensure that their children, youth, and young adults with disabilities and special health care needs lead rich, active lives as full members of their schools and communities. So the PEAL Center is a nonprofit organization made up mostly of parents and family members of children, youth, and young adults and with disabilities and special health care needs, as well as self-advocates. Under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, every state must have at least one parent training and information center to help families and empower and coach them in understanding what their rights are, what their children's rights are. Our funding comes from the Office of Special Education Programs, and we're excited that they're providing the funding for this series. Additionally, PEAL receives funds from the federal and state departments of health and other grants that to help us offer individual assistance and training related to special education, inclusion, healthcare, transition, and self-advocacy. Everything that PEAL does for families is provided at no charge to families. I'll put the PEAL website in the chat so you have that, and feel free to visit the website to find out more about our services and some great resources that are there as well. Back to you, Maggie.
Sorry about that, everyone. I had a little bit of a glitch there myself. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Maggie Gaines, a co-leader of Tredyffrin Easttown's Build TE and a member of the PA Inclusion Collective. We're so excited that so many family members, teachers, administrators, and community members are with us tonight. This is our 4th year that the PA Inclusion Collective has hosted a speaker series. Each year, we have brought in a speaker to talk about different aspects of including students with disabilities in schools. We've talked about why inclusion is important, and our speakers have offered practical advice to families and schools on how to include students with disabilities. But in this series, we get to the heart of why I am so passionate about inclusion. We will be talking specifically about belonging and how we can ensure every student, especially those who have often been the most excluded, can be accepted, valued, and befriended in our schools and communities. We are so lucky to have Dr. Erik Carter of Baylor University here with us tonight because he has spent decades researching, writing, and speaking on this very topic. During tonight's session and the 2 sessions that follow, we hope parents, teachers, and school leaders will think about how they can be catalysts for change in their schools and communities to ensure all our students feel a deep sense of belonging and can make lasting friendships. Erik's resume and list of research papers and publications is long. Please check out the link on the slide for more information about him and his work. After many years as a professor and researcher at Vanderbilt University, Erik accepted a new opportunity last year as the Luther Sweet Endowed Chair in Disabilities at Baylor University. He is also the executive director of the Baylor Center for Developmental Disabilities, where his work continues. His research addresses strategies for supporting inclusion and belonging in schools, workplaces, and congregations for children and adults with disabilities. He has published widely in the areas of educational and transition services, including more than 300 articles, chapters, and other publications. We've got a fantastic evening planned, so get comfy, grab a snack or dinner, get something to drink, and be ready to question old assumptions and learn new ways of viewing students in our communities. But before we get to Erik's presentation, I want to share a bit about who the PA Inclusion Collective is. We're a grassroots organization of parents representing 8 different school districts in the Philadelphia suburbs. Each of us involved in the collective is a parent to one or more student with a disability, and we're passionate about ensuring our children and all students are included in our schools and communities. Our mission is to bring nationally known speakers on inclusive education to our community to inspire families, teachers, school administrators, and staff to learn together and to use that knowledge to create more inclusive and equitable schools. We're always looking for fellow inclusionists to join us, so please check out our Facebook page, the PA Inclusion Collective. We're now up to more than 570 members, and the group is growing every day. We're creating a movement here in Pennsylvania and hopefully across the country. We need your voice to make lasting systemic change, so please join us. Also, a very important reminder before we get started. These sessions are meant to welcome and encourage dialogue among families, educators, and community members so that we can learn together about how to create a more equitable and inclusive community for all. Parents and educators must work together if we want to change the world. Please remember that we're each at different points of our personal journeys in this process. So let's acknowledge and accept that some of us are just getting started while others may be much further along. Now I'm going to play this video from Mia, a local high school student who has a message to share with us tonight.
Hi, my name is Mia Rodriguez, and I am an 8th grader in Chester County, Pennsylvania. I just want to talk about something that's been on my mind a lot lately. Belonging at school. You see, being a part of something, whether it's in class or in clubs, means a whole lot more than just showing up. For me, it's about feeling like I matter, like my voice counts. You know, when I'm included, whether it's in a science group project or in the drama club. Yeah, I was in my school play singing in the rain, and I had the role of the orchestra leader, and it was pretty awesome. I feel like I'm not just another face in the crowd. It's not just about grades or getting the main role, but it is about feeling like I belong, like I'm part of this big school family. And let me tell you, that feeling for me, it's everything. We can all learn with each other and from each other. Now, I hope everyone's comfortable and excited to learn because I am super excited about today's topic. It is so important to me and to so many of my friends. Let me introduce an expert in this field. He is the Luther Sweet Endowed Chair in Disabilities at Baylor University and Executive Director of the Baylor Center of Developmental Disabilities. Here is Dr. Erik Carter.
Well, greetings, everyone. And let me begin by just saying thank you to Maggie and Cindy and to the Peel Center and the PA Inclusion Collective for this invitation. But especially thank you to you, Mia. I think we have the tables turned. It sounds like you are the real expert on belonging. And so thank you for sharing that message about why this matters for you so much, because it matters for all of us. And I would say to all of you coming from all over Pennsylvania and certainly even around the country, what a pleasure it is to be with you this evening. I know I am among some parents and some educators and some school leaders and probably some advocates and instigators, all of whom are deeply invested in the flourishing of students with and without disabilities. And I mean that in the broadest way, academically, socially, personally, flourishing in all the ways that matter most. I think we are collectively striving to create classrooms and schools and districts and states where every person matters, where every person belongs, where, as Mia said, we're all part of one big family. And that is the work that makes me smile. So thanks for letting me be with you. I'm looking forward to these next 3 weeks with you. Now, I began my career as a high school special education teacher. But for the last 20 or so years, I've been a professor and a teacher trainer and a researcher whose work really does focus on thinking about how schools and workplaces and faith communities and others can be places where people with and without disabilities have the opportunity to learn and live and worship and work and serve and support one another right alongside one another in community together. And I think as we talk about schools primarily, we're really talking about making sure our classrooms are marked by rigor, yes, and relevance, yes, but also relationships for students with and without disabilities alike, especially in including those who also have more extensive support needs. I think the conversation that we're going to have is not about pitting learning and relationships up against one another, but how do we create schools where learning and belonging actually abound together? So it's great to have this time together with you, and we are going to think about how we move in ways that make sure more people can experience that assurance of belonging, where we try to peel back the often very thin veneer of inclusion, of things that look like inclusion, but are really its thin counterfeits, and to move something towards something deeper. So I've titled this talk Incomplete Without You, and have the subtitle of Creating Communities of Belonging for Every Student. And as you know, I think as was shared earlier with Maggie, everyone is in different places. And as I talk through this, I just want to say, this is not easy work or recipe work. It's work that matters, but it demands the best of our creativity and commitment to make a reality. So there are more than 7 million children and youth with disabilities attending schools all across the United States, from Pennsylvania all the way to my newly adopted state of Texas, to California and Hawaii and beyond. About 317,000 kids with disabilities in Pennsylvania. But that means nearly 1 in 7 kids have a disability that somehow impacts their learning or relationships. And for those students who have autism or intellectual disability or multiple disabilities, so often those are the students who are most at risk for exclusion. And so I don't know all of you, but I think we could begin by affirming some things that we all hold in common, some shared beliefs as we think about those 7 million students with disabilities and the many more without. We want our schools to be a place of belonging for every single student. We want our students to feel at home in their classrooms, to feel like true members of their school, as Mia said, as members of one big family. We want students to feel valued and accepted and needed by their peers and their teachers. And we want to strive to create the kind of connections among students that really lead to those reciprocal relationships and those friendships. Every one of those 7 million students should know for certain that they belong. And I think we'd all agree with that. The question is, how do we make that a reality or move things in the direction of that reality? And we're having that conversation today because belonging is still elusive for so many of our students, particularly those, again, who might have more extensive support needs. You can't assume it automatically just because kids are in the same school or classroom, and it's not always experienced. And I find so often in my work with schools, and even remember this as a high school teacher myself, how often our efforts to foster relationships end up taking this backseat to our focus on academic and behavioral outcomes. And then what happens is there are students who are just on the peripheries and the edges of our social circles in school life. So what does it look like to move in ways that change that landscape? That's where I'm going to park for the next hour. And although my accent today is going to be on fostering belonging for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the students I taught as a high school teacher, I think you're going to quickly see that the framework I share has relevance for fostering belonging for any student in your school. And I want to set the stage for this conversation by sharing kind of a little bit of kind of historical context, just a little background that comes from just our fields of education and special education, but probably is a really broader context for all of our society and culture. And I know that for many of you on this webinar, this is common knowledge for you. So you've been navigating this for some time, and for some of you, this has been your lived experience. But kind of looking back of where we've been helps us see where we want our schools to go next in this kind of stream of history. And so I'm going to use some imagery, maybe that you've seen variations of elsewhere. And I'll start with just kind of going back in time in my own lifespan. I'm 50 years old. I turned 50 this December. And at the time that I was born in 1973, so many students with disabilities found themselves wholly excluded from public education and so many other community opportunities. That was before Public Law 94-142. And so if you think about the picture on your screen of all of these circles reflecting members of a particular school or a particular community, going back in time 50 years ago, we would have said there were holes in our schools and communities. There were too many students that were still missing. Well, a lot of effort went into advocacy and school reform as new laws were passed, new policies pursued. What we started to see is so many opportunities emerge in the 70s and the 80s for students with disabilities, but they tended to be largely offered in segregated contexts, right? Entirely apart from anyone else who didn't have a similar label. And that's a strong word, but I think it is a fitting word for many of those prevailing models of schooling. It was separate special education schools, and students graduated then to specialized day programs or sheltered workshops or institutional living for adults. And what that meant is that most students without disabilities were growing up and receiving their formative education in the absence of their peers with disabilities. And think about what that means for the communities and the civic groups and the corporations and congregations that they'll lead if their schooling happens in the absence of their peers with disabilities. Well, over time, of course, many of you recall this because you either lived it or are advocating through this, but we saw the landscape changing quite a bit during the time I was in middle school and high school and then in college in the 80s and the 90s. That shift was really towards making sure students with disabilities were integrated or mainstreamed, right, within the ordinary aspects of school and community life. And that was incredible progress. But I think what we still often saw is as that integration movement happened, we still saw a certain amount of separation. And there were different classes down that rarely traveled hallway. Or as kids grew up, large group homes tucked into untraveled parts of town, or workplaces where people with developmental disabilities were in the workplace working near but not really among any other coworkers without disabilities. And that was the theme of this movement. Kids with disabilities being near, but not really among their peers without disabilities. Near, but not really among. And the distance between those two is more substantial than we often think. Well, that takes us to the present day. If we're thinking about this as kind of this history lesson and progression, where our emphasis around the country and around the world, and hopefully throughout your states, is on trying to promote the full inclusion of kids with disabilities in the same classrooms and clubs, and as they grow up in the same jobs and community groups as anyone else. Inclusion has been, it's been the dominant theme of the last at least 2 decades. And if you remember back in your English class when we had to diagram sentences and we would underline the nouns and the verbs and the prepositions, you could say that what we see on the screen was a movement of those prepositions. So we were shifting from kids being apart from one another to then becoming among one another and now being with one another. And so that is that's the progression, I think, that really does make all the difference. And so I put these up on your screen to really prompt your own reflection. We could probably just stop here and start talking about what we see on the screen, but in our midst. But I share them for a few key reasons. The first is that what I've put up on the screen isn't actually past history at all. I framed it that way, but it's actually not true. As many of you know from your own experiences looking around your community or around your state, what you see up on the screen isn't really past history, it's the present landscape that we see right now in our midst. You can see examples of exclusion and separation and integration and inclusion side by side in so many districts and regions and states. Here in my own new state of Texas, I would say we're a living history museum. I could drive an hour from this campus and show you examples of all 4 of these portraits of community within that short drive. And so I think the second reason that I'm sharing this is that, you know, these portraits also prompt our reflection as we think about the schools and the districts that we are trying to support and equip. Which of these portraits most closely resembles what we see? And why are we stuck where we're stuck? What would be the next destination on our journey? And third, though, I think the main reason I share these images is I think there's something more that we're going for in this movement of advocacy and equipping and calling people to next steps. There's another goal that I think we have in mind as we think about our schools, because when you spend time talking to students with disabilities, as you heard from Mia, and you talk with families about what matters most, even when you look at the literature, you start to see that people want to be more than just integrated or more than simply included. Instead, people really want to belong. And Mia articulated this so well. We all want to belong. And how do you picture that sort of visually? I think at one level, it means that we're a community now that isn't seeing one another as the ins and the outs and the labeled and the unlabeled and the members and the strangers, but wow, we're actually one community, diverse, absolutely, but every person of equal and immeasurable value. But also, it's not just that we come to see one another differently in our communities. I think it's something more than that, that a community of belonging or a school marked by belonging isn't just about sharing space for 6 or 7 hours each day or throughout the week. It's actually about coming to share our lives. And so kids become intertwined and we become knitted together and woven into relationships, and we stay involved in each other's lives after class ends and after the school bell rings or after we clock out of work. It's not about living parallel lives, it's about living and learning in community together. So I hope this series of images and sort of this way of talking about movements of these communities starts to resonate, and you start to see, wow, what is it we're really aiming for as we think about our own kids and our own students in classrooms. And you start to see that maybe there is something more than inclusion. We're not just here in talking just about sort of mere inclusion, but really about pursuing deep belonging. And I think there's a difference there for students. That's the difference between being present and actually having a presence in your school. And again, Mia articulated that well. It's not just showing up, but right, it's being part of that family. And for those of us who are teachers and school leaders, this is the difference between welcoming someone's presence. We're glad you came. We'll include you when you arrive, and actually aching because of their absence, missing kids who aren't part of our classes and our clubs and our communities. And this is the last destination that I really want to park my time with you on is what do we mean when we say we're trying to cultivate a community of belonging in our schools? How do the schools that we work at or lead become places of belonging for kids with disabilities, for any student who's been or felt excluded? And this is a really important question. I know that it's at one level you think, well, that's a kind of an easy thing to speak to. I mean, we all know the firsthand joy of belonging. We experience that joy when we do, and it's also something that we feel viscerally when we don't. We know the feeling of what it feels like to be excluded or to left out. But it does raise the question, if we're going to aim towards this, how do we know when we've arrived? How do we know if our students are experiencing this? And I think this is a question I want to send back to you. So hopefully you can find your chat, and I want you to finish a sentence for me as I describe this. And I want to hear what you all from all around Pennsylvania and beyond think about this. But think about your own lives, past or present, and think about a place where you have personally experienced belonging, whether that is in your workplace or in your neighborhood or in some affinity group or some community group. And as you think about a place where you personally, as a parent or a teacher, feel like you experience belonging, what would be the things that you point to that tell you that's the case, that kind of assure you that you belong? And so I know all of you have your videos off, and that's fine, but find your chat, and I want you to finish this sentence. I know I belong when blank. So this is a place, select everyone in your chat box, and then put down, finish that sentence. I know I belong when, boom, and I see Katie typed, I feel safe. I don't know if that shows up for everyone. Janelle, when I have friends or relationships with other people, right? When someone checks in on me, right? When my access needs are met, Allison shared. When people miss me, Pam noted. When I can't arrive without saying hello to everyone and leave without saying goodbye, right? Wonderful. Sarah says, I know when I feel at ease, I belong. Or Karen says, when people talk to me. Exactly. Just kind of keep posting those in, because you start to see this gives us hints at maybe the very same things that matter for all of our students, including our students with disabilities, but maybe the things that are often quite elusive. So you can kind of keep those popping in, and you can scroll through those as I talk. But this is the question I wanted to bring back to you as we think about our students. Like, what does it really look like for students with developmental disabilities to experience belonging in inclusive schools? And what are the experiences and the relationships that assure them that they have that cherished place in their learning community? And how does that belonging create this context for learning? I think if we're a school that's committed to this concept, we have to have a strong understanding of the practices and the postures that contribute to that goal. And so I think that's kind of part of what we want to share. So what are the things that tell us when we've arrived, and what provides us guidance along the way? Well, research and practice have a lot of insights to share about what leads to belonging. I'm not here to offer you the definitive word on the subject, certainly. I just want to share back what we are hearing and learning from our studies with students and from interviews with parents, from our work with teachers and schools across multiple states and projects. Out of that work, as we try to distill what is it that leads to belonging, or the markers of belonging for kids with disabilities, we've heard 10 key themes that come up over and over and over across that work. And this is what we hear in that. To belong is to be present. It's to be invited. It's to be welcomed and to be known. It's to be accepted and supported, to be heard, to be befriended, to be needed, and to be loved. And when each of these areas is addressed well, I think schools are much more likely to become learning environments where students with disabilities can thrive and come to be seen as valued members of our learning community. Well, what I want to do in our time together is walk through each of those 10 dimensions of belonging and talk briefly about what each means and why it matters. I'm going to try to share some snapshots from some of our studies that speak to these facets of belonging. But the real purpose is to begin to prompt you toward reflection about what you might ask for, advocate for, work toward in your child's schools or in the schools you lead or work in. And I want to do that by encouraging you to reflect on 4 questions as I walk through each of these 10 dimensions of belonging. One is, what are we doing really well right now? Or what are you seeing done really well right now for your son or daughter? And second, how do you know? What are the things that we can point to that tell us our students are experiencing being known and accepted or supported or befriended? And third, what are some things that you, if you're a teacher, for example, could do better or differently? Or as a parent, perhaps you could do better or differently as well. And then fourth, what should we begin doing next? So these are the 4 reflection questions, and those are going to be posted in the chat. I think we'll post a downloadable tool that you can download from there if you would like as well. So again, for those of you who are thinking about from a school perspective, be thinking about what the implications of this are for the practices and the policies you pursue, or the funding you allocate, or the training you offer, or the resources you provide. Do they aim towards belonging, or are they leading away from it? So we're going to start with the first of these 10 areas, which is presence. And that's because so often belonging does begin with presence. It's built on a foundation of shared experiences and repeated encounters over time. It's to be involved each and every day in the same places as anyone else in your school. It's about being part of the everyday fabric of school life, just like anybody else. Being part of that drama club, like Mia mentioned, or those challenging classes. And yet it's so hard to feel like you belong if you're never or rarely part of the array of activities and events that make up the life of a particular community. Always being on the outside, kind of looking in. And so students with and without disabilities should be participating together in the same classrooms and hallways and playgrounds and cafeterias and clubs, to encounter one another as they learn and they play and they connect with one another. In other words, the hope here is that the presence of students with disabilities, including those with more extensive support needs, is a natural and expected everyday part of school. Now, you all, some of you are thinking about this as family members, about your children. Some of you are thinking about the breadth of movements in your local school. And know that nearly 1 in 7 children, about 15% of almost any school, has a disability that somehow impacts their learning and their relationships. And for some students, this impact may be fairly substantial, might be readily apparent. And for others, those needs may be much less visible or only evident in certain areas. But it raises this point of reflection again. What would a peek into our classrooms and our cafeterias or our courtyards and clubs say about the presence of students with developmental disabilities in all of the activities that make up the life of your school? Are they on the peripheries of what you offer as a school, or are they right at the center? And the data really suggest a very kind of mixed portrait as we think about being present in the life of a school. There are some data that speak kind of partly to this area of presence. So if we're going to assume that most of the school day for most students is spent in this interesting range of academic and elective and related arts classes, we do have some data on whether students with disabilities are taking those same classes alongside their peers. And what you start to see in some of these patterns is that absence from general education classrooms is often more common than presence. So let me illustrate by sharing some of these. So there's a portrait just in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to put up on the screen the percentage of students with served under various special education categories that are receiving or spending certain proportions of time in general education classrooms. So I've got it organized by those receiving special education under intellectual disability category, autism, emotional behavioral disorders, or all disabilities. And so this first percentage is the percentage of students under those categories who are in separate schools or other settings outside of their local public school. So that's about 10% of students in Pennsylvania with an intellectual disability are in a different school altogether. This is the percentage of students who are in a mix of, who spend less than 40% of their school day in general education classrooms. So these are from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act data that's collected from each state. So 47% of students are spending no or little time in general education classrooms, mostly in special education classrooms. And then this is the percent in yellow of those who spend a mix of time in general education and special education. And finally, this is the percentage of students who spend almost all of their school day in general education classrooms. And so you see it varies widely among students with the same special education label and across different special education labels. But for many students, including those with intellectual disability, more than half of those students spend very little time in classes alongside their peers who don't have an intellectual disability. Now, one of the fascinating things about this is how variable this is from state to state. And this should tell us something about sort of what are the root causes and differences in placement patterns. So this next graphic, I'm not going to show you a lot of data as we go, but I think this is a really interesting one to point out. This is the, I'm going to skip that. This is the percentage of students with intellectual disability who spend between 40% and 100% of their school day in classrooms with peers without disabilities. So somewhere between nearly half and all of their school day. And these are just for students with intellectual disability, and it shows what it looks like across states. So what you might notice, the states are too small and it's not important which is which. But if you are in Florida and you have an intellectual disability, you would have a 20% chance of having that kind of level of general education participation. But if you're in Vermont, you have an 80% chance. And in Pennsylvania, that's the number in red. It's roughly in the middle of all of this group. But isn't that interesting what wide variations your experience will be of inclusion or general education participation, depending on which state you happen to live in? And now the distribution of this, the percentages and slightly different disability definitions vary across state, but this is equating them on percentage. My point in all this is it's not simply the nature of the disability that's driving placement decisions. If students with intellectual disability are similar in Florida and Vermont, yet you have a 20% versus an 80% chance, that's pretty dramatically different. And that's an intriguing spectrum of placement patterns, which ought to cause us to reflect on what is going on here. And it reminds me of a quote by Michael Giangreco, who retired recently from the University of Vermont, who said, "For every student who remains educationally segregated, there are other students with similar attributes or abilities and needs who are successfully included. This simple fact suggests that whether a student with a disability is meaningfully included may have less to do with his or her characteristics and more to do with the attitudes and skills and structure and practices of the adults responsible for providing education." And that is a sort of complicated quote, but when you think about it, why is it that two kids with the same special education label have such widely varied experiences depending on what state they live in, or what region, or what district? And it suggests to us that there are other things standing in the way of presence in our schools and districts beyond just the needs of particular students. So what is it that stands in the way of presence in your school or district? What are the barriers that have to be broken down? Maybe it's barriers of awareness or limited training. Maybe that's what you're noticing. Or maybe what stands in the way of presence is barriers of attitude or expectations. Or you feel like it's barriers of finances or resources or commitment or values or just the sort of narrow boundaries of our imagination that we have to expand. My point in this is just simply to say presence is the baseline for belonging. It's our starting point, but it's not our destination. It's not simply being in the same place. There's something more that we're pursuing. And I see a lot of other examples also being posted. We are going to distribute out all of the slides, so you'll have access to those for those of you who are kind of scribbling quotes and notes. And of course, you could add other barriers to that list. But let's start with presence, but that's integration, or that's not the same thing as belonging. So again, for those of you who are parents and teachers and are thinking about this for my son or daughter, for the students in my school, you might use this as a point of reflection. What are we doing really well right now in our district? Let's celebrate those things and keep doing them. How do we know? What are the kind of data we're collecting that speak to kids being present? And are there things we could do better or differently or next in terms of our advocacy? So we'll put up that slide at the end of each of these sections. But to be present is important, but we've got to figure out how we go further. And because absence is so common, we have to think about invitation as the remedy to absence, right? This is about being invited, about being pursued. And there is something really powerful about being picked by someone else. And some of you mentioned this in the chats that were flurrying about belonging for you. And there's something wounding about not being picked. I mean, how encouraging is it to know that others want to be in your midst, that your company is desired or even needed? And such an experience like that of having your presence really sought out or pursued sends a powerful message to kids. We want you here, right? We need your presence. It just wouldn't be the same here without you. And in a sense, like in a certain sense, like at least public schools are mandated to invite kids with disabilities into the doors of our schools. But parents and students here were talking about much more, not just being invited into school, but really into the breadth of things that are offered. We want invitations to abound for students within our schools. We want ordinary gestures like being asked by peers to sit together at lunch, to join in games at recess, to collaborate on a project, to come to a birthday party, to attend a sleepover. Those kinds of ordinary invitations we want to just be par for the course. And yet those invitations seem to be still fairly rare for some of the students that we work with. I want you to also think about these data that come from a national study. These aren't Pennsylvania specific data. They come from something called the National Longitudinal Transition Study in the United States. The data are a little more than 10 years old. We don't have more recent data here, but they asked for reports of the experiences, the social experiences of teenagers with various disabilities. And one of the questions was the extent to which your son or daughter was invited to social activities in the past 12 months. That's how that question was worded. And half of all teenagers with autism had not been invited to social activities by any other youth in the past 12 months, 51%. And that was true for 1 in 4 youth with intellectual disability. The numbers are a little bit less, a little bit better in elementary school, but honestly, not substantially so. So how do we ensure that students with disabilities are put in, have the opportunities to encounter other kids so that those invitations might abound? But there's also a role for those of us who are educators and school leaders. Are we making sure that students with disabilities are invited by teachers to join extracurricular clubs, to be part of those inclusive field trips, to contribute on service projects, to have a leadership role, to be part of other school activities? Belonging so much emerges when those kinds of invitations just become an everyday, ordinary occurrence. They're coming from peers and teachers and from others at school. Yeah, I see student council and other kinds of places. We're not just thinking about classes, but we're also thinking about all the in-betweens. And for those of you who are kind of commenting on that, we'll talk about that actually on the 3rd session of how do we think not just about the times between bells when students are in class, but how do we think about cafeterias and playgrounds and clubs and after-school programs and all those sorts of places that are so socially rich in opportunity, but often aren't capitalized as we think about planning and supports for students. How do those invitations to students with disabilities come without asterisks? That's really what we're trying to push here. Well, third, when we think about belonging, it involves being welcomed. It's the way students are greeted and treated by others that says a lot about their place within the community. And so to be welcomed is to be received by others with warmth and friendliness, with an authentic delight, that people find pleasure in your presence. Now, most of the research here tends to be qualitative. It's drawn from interviews with students about how they feel when they're at school. And I think that's a good thing. That's the way it should be. It's not the host who determines what's welcoming, it's the guest. And so we have to understand what students' experiences are and to be able to invite those perspectives and think about how do we understand what students' perspectives are when they may have complex communication needs or communicate in other ways. But that sense of being welcomed is really important. The data that we have it's kind of in this space, but I think it reveals something about the opportunities to be welcomed. And here are data from a project we did of students with intellectual disability who were enrolled in general education classrooms. And we did a study of about 108 or so high school students with intellectual disability. They were all involved in at least one general education high school class. Some were academic classes, some were related arts classes, that sort of thing. What we did is we were actually looking at their social connections and their learning in those classrooms. But we happened to collect data on two interesting measures. One was, when did they arrive to class and when did they leave class? And the other was, when they were in class, who were they sitting near? Were they within a few feet of any other kids in that class? Or were they sitting off to the side or off in the back where they were only next to a teacher and not near, or a paraprofessional and not near other kids? And I think this impacts the opportunities you have to be welcomed. And I see some of that in the chat. We are not forcing interactions or relationships, but we're also doing everything we can to not prevent them. And we're doing what we can to set the occasion for them to happen. But in this study, what was interesting is if you look all the way to the left, this is the percentage of students. The orange is the percentage of students who have arrived when the bell rang in class. So if you look at the far left at the start of the bell, only 70% of students with intellectual disability who were part of that class were in the classroom when class started. They were arriving late from a therapy. They were waiting to travel the hallways when they cleared out. And it was so a fourth of all the students weren't even there at the very beginning of class. And if you go all the way to the far right of this figure, what you see is by the time the bell rings that class is done, half of the students with intellectual disability had already left early. Now, that's really interesting about why people are arriving late and coming early. But when are all the social opportunities in a class? At the beginning before it begins, and at the end when classwork is done. And that's the very times, and kids are missing these opportunities to connect. Not to mention what you miss about the learning activity if you've missed the beginning and you've missed the end. So that increases really impacts that sense of belonging if you're simply not even there. But the yellow data is also really interesting because that's the percentage of those 108 students who at any given point of class were sitting within just a few feet of any other peers without disabilities. And it was relatively few at the beginning of class and relatively few at the end. So if I were going to summarize that kind of complicated figure, here's what we found, is for kids who were enrolled in general education classrooms, 16% of the time, they weren't even there. And 58% of the class, when they were there, they weren't sitting close enough to any other student to actually have a conversation, to share classwork, to ask a question, to work on a group project. Instead, those students were sitting next to a paraprofessional or a special education teacher. And so the opportunities to engage and be part of the class in similar ways were inadvertently limited. Now, that is not inclusion, that's general education participation, but not with the right opportunities and supports. And you could translate this to all kinds of other contexts. What does that look like in a workplace, in a faith community, or a recreation program where we see similar kinds of patterns? My point in all of this is just to emphasize that, we can't assume simply because someone's enrolled in a class that they're experiencing that sense of welcome when they're there. All of this reminds me, for those of you who've been in the field a really long time, it reminds me of an article 30 plus years ago called Peter, He Comes and Goes, First Graders' Perspectives on a Part-Time Mainstream Student. And so the point of that article was like, what do the other kids perceive when the student comes late and leaves early and comes and goes at intermittent time? Are they a full member of this class, or are they really a part-time member? So this sense of being welcomed is really something we want to be intentional about. And how do students feel welcome? They feel welcomed when others greet them or strike up a conversation, sit with them at lunch or ask about their day, or join them in shared activities. When other kids remember their birthday, and or when they, as someone said in the chat earlier, notice when they're not there and follow up to find out why. It's those ordinary gestures that send this powerful message that students are really wanted. And so the extent to which students feel genuinely welcomed in their classrooms or at their school, that really does elevate their enthusiasm for learning, and it solidifies their sense of membership. And when that hospitality abounds, kids get excited about going to school each day. And when it's absent, that's when they feel more reluctant or uncomfortable. And this sense of being welcomed, I think, comes a lot through the gestures of those of you who are staff, for example, or peers. When people are not sure what to say or what to do, when kids aren't, peers are reluctant about what to say or do, that kind of reluctance sometimes leads to avoidance. And so here's a place where we can provide for peers information and guidance and modeling. Let's show peers what it looks like to converse with a student who has complex communication challenges, or to work collaboratively with someone who has more extensive support needs. That's sometimes the guidance that peers might need. But it's not just that. Sometimes school staff need that same guidance. Gen ed teacher who needs to learn more about how to teach and engage with students who communicate differently, or require ongoing assistance, or behave in unfamiliar ways, or how to talk about disability in relevant ways, or to design their instruction and spaces with a broader range of students in mind. And so how do we help provide that training and guidance to peers or to staff who might really not sort of catch what it looks like to really give that warm welcome and authentic delight? And here too, I hope you're noticing some things that are going really well in your kids' schools or in your own schools. But how do you know? What are the things that we're noticing or capturing? What could we do better or different, and where do we go next? Well, a fourth aspect of belonging that came out of these projects is being known. And this reminds me of that old theme song from the show Cheers, right? I won't sing it, but it was sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name, right? Where they're always glad you came. And there's something that, kids often love to hear their names shouted, right, across a room, or uttered from the other end of a phone, or called out in a group. But interesting here, the joy of being known wasn't just about being noticed and recognized by name. What we really heard in this work is about being understood deeply and personally, to be seen as a unique individual and appreciated for all of who you are, to have relationships with people who understand you and affirm you. That's part of belonging. And yet sometimes some students with developmental disabilities are often kind of strangers in their own school. If you're spending most of your school day in separate classrooms, or you're always on the periphery of school and classroom activities, well, then the opportunities to develop a relationship with other students and staff just become more limited. So that's an element of this sort of being known, is that people know you personally. They know you by name. But what we heard so often from students and families, it's not just whether someone's known, but also it's important how someone is known. And this is a point worth parking on just a little bit longer, because so often in our schools, the labels that we use to categorize students, so often, I think they inadvertently shape how children come to be known. And so often those definitions are built around kids' struggles rather than their strengths. They're defined around their challenges rather than by their contributions. And you see that in the definitions that we often use around certain disabilities. It's always in the language of deficits and challenges and limitations. But I think there's a danger here in only knowing students in terms of these kinds of framing. that they flatten the portraits of how these students are known. It really is the danger of telling a single story about a person that all one needs to know is what's difficult or challenging, when it's equally true that students with disabilities have wonderful strengths and talents and personalities and character and interests that are exciting to get to know, right? Just like anyone else. That there's a different way to know our students and to talk about them and to introduce them by the strengths and the gifts and the passions and the positive qualities that they bring to their relationships and their communities. Really by the things that remind us that someone is absolutely indispensable, not to know someone by the things that imply they're somehow incapable. And can we come to see kids with developmental disabilities in this way of having strengths and contributions and gifts to be received? And I see that, yeah, in the chat. This is about strengths-based ways of knowing our students. It reminds me of a study we did maybe 10 years ago, where we asked about 500 parents of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, parents of adolescents, I should say, 13 to about 21 years old. And we asked them to complete an assessment. That's not unfamiliar, but this assessment was actually about the child's strengths. It was called the Assessment Scale for Positive Character Traits. It was an interesting scale. It was a research measure we used, and had these 26 statements about the extent to which their child demonstrates characteristics like kindness and humor and gratitude and empathy and optimism and courage. And I'm just going to put up on the blue bar the percentage of parents in our project who said, that trait is a lot like my child. And so 93% said my child's happy. 86% said my child is joyful or enjoys life. 86% said my child's got a great sense of humor. My child's thoughtful and helpful to others. My child's quick to demonstrate care for other people. 78% said their child was thankful for life's simple pleasures or was empathetic. They were bothered or concerned or upset when someone else was uncomfortable or distressed. They described their children as courageous or as resilient and as quick to forgive. And this is one of these data points that tells you sort of families are being honest. Only 2/3 of families said my adolescent is quick to forgive. And I don't know a lot of adolescents that are quick to forgive. But you start to see the point of this. Like, can we find a place for these strengths in our schools and in our communities? I mean, aren't our schools enriched by finding a place for someone known for their gratitude and their empathy and their kindness? And how many peers might want to develop a friendship with someone who's funny and happy and thoughtful? And how many of these kinds of enviable traits are we trying to cultivate in our students as well? This seems to be the kind of thing that we want for any of our students. We see some schools try to use this way of framing strengths by placing them in one-page profile so that when they introduce a student to an employer or to a teacher, part of the story they're telling is here's the strengths and gifts and talents and contributions of this particular person. And that's one way to think about tangibly sort of how do we introduce one. Now, if you look at an IEP, what you see is challenge, deficit, difference, whatever. How do we change that narrative by coming to know those strengths and then talking about them often? And I think another way to think about that is as young people grow up and as students graduate and we think about jobs, how are we making sure we know our students' strengths well enough to figure out where in the community could some employer use exactly someone with those strengths and contributions? So in my old state of Tennessee, we had a Hire My Strengths campaign, and it was basically framed on the foundation that businesses don't hire people based on what they can't do. They hire people based on what they can do. And it turns out that our graduating students with developmental disabilities could do a lot and had incredible strengths. But we had to know them. We had to communicate them to people who might not see through that particular lens. And so I think that's a really great way to do it. And Maggie, great point around the resumes, right? That's what we feature. Can we essentially create resumes? Are we fluent enough in our students' strengths to be able to communicate them well to others? I think for many of you who are families, that's, I hope, how you see your children with disabilities. But schools that are committed to belonging have to learn each student's story. We have to strive to understand our kids' interests and passions and skills and talents, the things they bring to community, And when we do that well, when we know our students well, we're better positioned to support and befriend and need and love those students. So again, it's a place to do some reflection. What are you doing, seeing happen really well in your school? How do you know how students are known? What would you look at that might, what's the portrait communicated in an IEP that tells you we're seeing and recognizing those kinds of strengths? And what could you do better or differently or next? Well, it's one thing to be included, it's quite another to be accepted. And when we have interviewed parents about the markers of inclusion for their children with disabilities, parents like many of you talk about your daughters or your sons being welcomed without condition and treated like family and embraced for all of who they are. Those are the things we want to be the stories of families. We want to hear from families over and over. And I know that some of you, that's your story, but many of you, that's not your story. That's not what we hear often from families over and over in our projects and interviews. Attitudes have changed a lot across our country in those last 50 years, but we are still a long way from that assurance of acceptance. And for those of you who are school leaders and teachers, these are the quotes that we hear from families in our projects as they talk about what they hear from their local schools. They hear, we don't really do inclusion here, or we're just not equipped to serve your child. Or perhaps you'd feel more comfortable at a place with a special program for her, or we're not sure he'll really get much out of being in our typical classes, or her behaviors are a bit of distraction, or students like her are served in our self-contained classrooms as a priori decision. Even before we've ever met your child, we've already decided where she goes. It raises the question of what are the attitudes that undergird these kinds of quotes, but what are the attitudes that pervade our schools? Schools are these rare places where the lives of students from so many different backgrounds intersect in one place. And so we want, as our students are learning and playing alongside each other, they're going to encounter others whose characteristics and experiences and circumstances differ from their own. And so promoting acceptance amidst this diversity is central to supporting belonging. It's about being embraced gladly without condition. It's about being viewed as an equal. And this is a hard place. I know there'll be questions about, well, how do you change the attitudes? And it is not easy work. It is long haul work. But it is the work we have to step into and work at collectively. I think as a field, we do know a lot more now about the pathways for changing attitudes. There is a place for sharing accurate information, for providing education related to disability. There's a place for hosting activities for students or staff or even families that raise awareness and increase understanding. There's a lot of power in what we each model to others and in the stories that we tell, because when we hold high expectations and we support those shared activities, we start to see attitudes start to change. But here's sort of the complex place. It's almost the chicken and egg place, because it turns out the investments that we make in fostering friendships and in promoting inclusive activities that actually has the most substantial impact on the views that others hold. In other words, personal contact, that's the key to promoting acceptance. Research examining attitude change so often points to the importance of supporting positive interactions over time as really one of the most promising pathways for changing views towards students with developmental disabilities. In other words, real acceptance doesn't simply come from learning about someone, like an awareness campaign, though that might have a place. It comes from coming to know someone personally. It's when you're in a science lab together or on a small group project together or serving in a club or in a PE class together that your preconceived ideas about someone who was the other to you start to get overturned. And so how do we think not just about the broader awareness efforts, as important as they are, but how do we get people engaged in shared activities that those preconceived attitudes and ideas start to get overturned? What are you seeing in your school in terms of students being welcomed and embraced and viewed as equals by their peers and by others? What are the things that need to happen differently? And Jackie, I appreciate your point. So often peers are modeling what they see others do. And so what is our what are the postures that communicate that we as teachers and staff are embracing that acceptance and that welcome? Well, 6, support is critical to belonging. And it's true, our capabilities aren't evident in what we can do on our own, but rather what we can do with the right amount of opportunity and support. And so this is about having the individualized resources that one needs to thrive in their learning and in their schooling. And students with developmental disabilities are going to often need more support to participate fully in the life of their school. It might be academic assistance in certain classes or social support during non-instructional times. It might be behavioral supports across the school day or emotional supports as a form of care. And for some students, it's occasional support, and for some, it's ongoing and substantial. But this provision of individualized support, this is the tangible demonstration of our school's commitment to their educational flourishing. When we provide support, it communicates a desire for kids' presence, and the absence of support is what leads to exclusion and limits meaningful participation. So schools that are marked by belonging have to see this delivery of individualized support as a core commitment. And I'm not talking here about a compliance mindset, but we're seeing compliance as the floor. How do we truly support meaningful involvement in those classes and clubs and cafeterias and playgrounds in ways that we are noticing lead to greater connection and learning and belonging? So this is the place for asking really good questions. The best supports are individualized and contextualized. We determine them one person at a time. So if you're with a school, are we using person-centered approaches for planning so that we're figuring out what supports are most beneficial for which child? Are we building the capacity of staff to support a diversity of students well in our classes and programs? Are we encouraging peers and equipping peers to be natural supports as classmates and schoolmates when students might need extra assistance? And are we regularly going back to revisit those supports to making sure they really work well for each student? So to foreshadow what we'll talk about the next 2 weeks is all supports are not created equal. And there's this inclination we so often sometimes have as parents to request professionals to be those supports, or as teachers to think a paraprofessional is the best way to support a student. But I want to just sort of say there's some reasons to be cautious about those kinds of approaches. That sometimes in our efforts to think about teachers and paraprofessionals and related service providers as the primary support for students, we crowd out peers and other more natural sources of support in the process. You'll see this in the next 2 webinars when we dive deep on these practices, but there are really practical ways of thinking about inviting other peers to be fellow classmates and schoolmates, to have formal and informal roles of support. We call these peer-mediated approaches. There's lots of different names that one might use, and in every single study that I've been part of, we found noticeable advantages when students with disabilities receive some of their support from same-age peers and classmates rather than exclusively from adults. And so the question is, what are we advocating for? And how are we engaging all of our students in these kinds of ways? We'll talk more about the reciprocity of these and the difference they make. And you'll see links in the handouts when you get them to some practical tools you can use to advocate for these approaches in your child's school or with your fellow coworkers and staff. But again, the point is being supported is an important part of belonging. Well, 7th is to be heard, and everyone wants to be listened to and understood, to know that your voice is really valued. That's not just empowering, it helps you feel more connected to others. So to be heard is that really that your perspective is sought out and listened to and respected. And so there's an element here of trying to amplify the voices of students that promotes their self-determination and their self-worth and their sense of belonging. We know students talk about feeling heard at school reminds them that they're important, that their voice matters, that they have a seat at the table, that they're valued, and that they have ideas worth sharing. And this is important because so often the voices and perspectives of students with developmental disabilities aren't often sought out. And so we want to really equip our students in this way to to be able to share ideas, to be able to set goals, to be able to express preferences and contribute to conversations in the classroom. And so this is a place to think about how can we teach some of the skills that students need to know their preferences and know their perspectives and to share those others verbally through communication systems and elsewhere. The better our students understand themselves, including their strengths and their interests and their needs and their goals, the better position they are to advocate for themselves and to advocate for others as well. So this is a place for those of you who are parents that can be really, really helpful. Think about how you can cultivate some of those skills and traits that enable your child to share their perspective and have a voice. Skills like choice making and decision making, or problem solving and goal setting, self-management, self-advocacy, and leadership, and on and on. These are skills that can be taught, but they are developed over time. And you as parents, this is a great guide that you all can download. It's completely free if you'd like. And it walks you some ways you can promote these kinds of things at home with your child. So to be heard is important, and are the perspectives of students with disabilities sought out and listened to and respected by others? Well, eighth, belonging is rooted for relationships. And Jill, will post that link in. It'll be in the handouts as well. We'll post that back up in a bit. But relationships are really important. It's about having people in our lives who know us and like us and accept us and need us and miss us and love us. Those are the things that are at the heart of anyone's well-being. And of course, the same is true for students with developmental disabilities. The desire for friendship or other supportive relationship is not different or diminished. It's grounded in this core belief that we thrive most in community. It's about having someone else in your life, a friend in your life who says, I choose you back. And we all know firsthand the ways that friendships contribute to our well-being, the way they give meaning to our lives and make us who we are and help us navigate challenges and bring us joy. It's just not good to be alone. And so many of the other dimensions of belonging that I've mentioned so far can kind of be done in the absence of a close and ongoing relationship. They can, I guess what I mean by it is, it kind of be done at arm's length. Like, you can be welcoming and you can be accepting and you can arrange supports, but friendships take belonging deeper. And this is both the art and science that we're going to talk about. We'll come back to these next 2 weeks, because this is where belonging often becomes the most elusive in this sense, because alone is so often what we see for some of our students. Many of you are familiar with kind of the idea of doing these circles of relationship mapping, where you think about, for example, in your own life, all the people that you know, and you put them in these 4 circles of your family members, right? This inner circle, people, relationships, parents, cousins, siblings, those kinds of things. And then you've got your friends and close companions, and hopefully you have names that abound in all of these different areas, right? Friends that might go back in time, like Maggie saying in nursery school, some that might be more recent. And then you've got a lot of people that are more in that kind of acquaintances category, or occasionals, right? Your neighbors, your coworkers, Facebook friends probably go in the circle, I think, I'm not sure. But people you see occasionally or are in the inner friend circle. And then you've got a lot of people who, just to put it bluntly, are paid to be in your life, right? Your doctor and your auto mechanic, your boss, your principal. Names would hopefully abound for you, hopefully in every circle, and all of those relationships can be really important. What we find so much in our projects, both in our research, but it bears out in the stories that so many families share and teachers share, is that when you do this set of reflection circles for some students with developmental disabilities, it's not that you really see less names showing up on the chart. It's that we tend to see them in different circles. Family members, like so many of you, are so critical sources of support. And then a lot of professionals and paid supports, paraprofessionals, special educators, general education teachers, principals, OTs, PTs, SLPs, nurses, healthcare providers. But too often we see few names or fewer names in those friends and those close companions and occasional circles. It's not just anecdotal, it's also what the data bear out. And so often it's not that our students with disabilities have a shortage of relationships with adults, It's about trying to think about how we promote those relationships with peers that are so central to belonging. Because those friendships, their presence can be enriching, their absence can sometimes feel wounding, and yet the studies suggest that often these friendships can be elusive. I'm going here back in the handout, and you can come back to this a little bit later afterwards. Data from that same study of adolescents with various disabilities, where they reported on the percentage of students, in this case, for example, autism, who never or rarely received phone calls from friends. These are teenagers, 13 to 16. That was true for 3/4 of young people, and almost half hadn't gotten together with friends in the past 12 months. These are the kinds of things that you can't make people be friends, but we've learned a couple things. One is we sometimes do things in ways that prevent that from ever having that opportunity, but there are things we can do to be intentional about trying to promote them, or they just don't happen automatically. So for those of us who are teachers, as we think about the students that we're planning for and teaching and serving, for each of those students, can we name other kids in that school that the student can eat with, or walk with, or celebrate with, or cry with, or play with, or pray with, or shop with, or catch a movie with, or share a Spotify song list with, or watch the Grammys with, or fill it in. And these are the questions we want to be able to pose and be able to name students. And if we can't, to rethink, what are we doing? What do we need to do differently that put students in the position to have those kinds of relationships? I would argue that relationships have to be among a central marker of any experience that we label as inclusive or inclusion. You can't call it inclusive education if no one knows her name, and you can't really call it a learning community if the student's never part of that community. And so we'll come back to this next week, but this is a place where we have to, learn with. Thank you, Lisa. That needs to be added to as well, since we're talking about schools. But there is kind of a formula for fostering friendships. And again, it's more art than science, but most friendships form for anyone through shared activities around common interests over time, right? If you have shared activities around common experiences or interests or passions, and that happens repeatedly, we shouldn't be surprised when students start to pick one another as friends. And when any one of those pieces is missing, it's not surprising when they have few friendships. Now we'll talk about this next week, but we would add that having valued roles in those shared activities helps with friendship, and having enough support to be part of those activities is critical for our students with developmental disabilities. So we'll come to that, but I wanted to just drop for now, this has implications for how we're thinking about programming and schooling related to our students. If our main models of educational service delivery are primarily separate or segregated, then that just decreases dramatically the opportunity for someone to be chosen as a friend. And if the opportunities that we provide are largely separate and segregated, that means the opportunity for other kids without disabilities to encounter the friendship and the gifts and the enviable qualities that we talked about earlier that every student has, they also miss out because those opportunities are more limited. And so we want to make sure that this is part of our conversation. Belonging isn't about being just in a place. It's about the relationships that you form. It's less about the programs. It's more about the peers and the people. And I think that takes us also then to this 9th dimension of belonging. And hang in there with me. We're almost to number 10. But I think many of us would agree that the richest form of community are really marked by a reciprocity, right? Every person is seen as having skills and talents and strengths that benefit others and the broader community. And I would say that's true of our schools. Every student has to be seen as a significant member, recognized for the contributions that they can and they do make. Mia's contributions in that school drama, she's needed as part of that group. And that's about being valued by others and being really seen as really an indispensable member of the community. I think we probably agree that every student in our midst has immeasurable worth, but we also know that not every student in our midst feels valued, and some students feel less valued or less needed than others. But when students with disabilities assume valued roles in their school and their community, then that's one way to start to change those perspectives and those attitudes. The more we can connect students to experiences where they can come to be needed by others, that can be transformative. That might come from connecting students to volunteer experiences or taking on leadership responsibilities, helping others in need, participating in a high status activity, students getting to help assist on important projects. Maybe it's leading their own IEP meeting or having an after-school job or having a role on a team. All of those are valued roles that start to sort of change perspectives of others in your midst, that your contributions are valued, that you have a place in this community, that you're significant and important. And then to harken back to something that someone put in chat way, way long ago, I can't see anymore, is when others start to need you, that's when your absence is missed. Like if you have a valued role and you're not there, people start to miss you. And as someone had pointed out, that's when you know you belong, when people really do miss your presence. And I'll come back to this maybe in a later one of our later conversations about what peers miss out on when they miss out on the opportunity to need their classmates with developmental disabilities. So we'll run out of time for that today. But again, this is a place I think these last three become a real struggle. It's one thing to support someone, it's another to accept them, another to welcome them. It's different to be befriended and to be needed, and last of all of these, to be loved. And I think this is something that comes up so often in our interviews with parents, like many of you, and with the stories of students, but is this importance of being in a community where you're loved. And that's the thing about love, right? People go to great lengths for the people they love. Think about the people you love and the way you or they make allowances or go the extra mile or extend grace, the way we sacrifice our interests and avoid what is easy or expedient. Love, it turns out, is the thing that compels us to invite and welcome and know and accept and support and befriend and need others. And when people talk about the communities that matter, most of them, they often, not always, but they often talk about the love that they encounter there. And I think that this is true of our schools, that when love abounds, that's when belonging is the most likely to be experienced. And I don't know if it sounds odd that a researcher is mentioning that. It's interesting how rarely love comes up in the professional literature, if at all, or it's not really listed as an evidence-based practice. You never really hear it touched on in trainings, but I think we all know firsthand what love has to do with belonging. And students with disabilities, like anyone else, yearn to be part of a school community where they can love and be loved. And that's the kind of place where belonging is most likely to be experienced. So that too is a place to think about, are our students, all of our students, experiencing a deep and gracious love of others? And how do we know what's going really well? What do we need to do better or different or even think about doing next? Well, that's the portrait of belonging that comes from the vantage point of our projects that have involved students with disabilities and their families and teachers and many others in this collection of projects that I've been able to be part of over the years. And I think it's something that pushes us to reflection. And I know this is hard for those of you who are families who are like, these are of course the things I want, but how do we make them a reality? I think for those of us working in schools or advocating within schools, these become reflection points. Are students with disabilities actively and personally invited? Are they present in all aspects of the life of the school, within and beyond the classroom? Are they experiencing a warm welcome whenever they arrive? Are they well known throughout the school by their peers and by teachers? And I would add, are they not just well known, but are they known well, accepted without condition or caveat? Are they provided the support they need to be part of all the parts of school life that are important to them? And are they asked to share their perspectives? And are those perspectives listened to and honored? Are they developing and deepening their friendships with others? Are they seen as needed and indispensable to the thriving of that community? And are those students loved deeply and unconditionally? And again, it's a point of reflection. What are we doing really well right now in all of those areas? What could we do better or more of or differently? And these are just 10 ideas for how we might move forward. The question you have to think about is, what does that look like for you in your child's life, in your child's school, in the school you teach in or lead in or serve in, those are the questions that become sort of really pressing for us. So I'm gonna think I'll fast forward, and you'll see I skipped some slides, but we'll come back to those when you get the handouts. We'll come back to those in some of the future sessions. I guess I'll close with this portion by just putting back up those 5 portraits up on the screen. And again, using this as a point of reflection as we think about the schools that we're working in or trying to support, or the schools where our kids are going to school. Which of these portraits best describes the communities that we see on our midst? And in all of what I've shared tonight, are you hearing things that might move towards from the left to the right of away from exclusion and more towards this place of inclusion and perhaps even belonging? It's a hard, long journey. I'm not presenting any of this as recipe work in any way, but to just point out that these become markers that we start to reflect on and notice and think about what we can advocate for and aim toward. And I'm just so grateful for all of you for being part of this, for being a point of influence in your school or in your community. I think this work towards transforming our learning communities towards inclusion and belonging is the work that matters most. It's the hardest work, but it's at the heart of what we really want our schools to be about. So thanks for being allies and partners and advocates and efforts in this way. And I'm gonna, I think I'll bring it to a pause here, and we'll transition over to some of the things you're wondering about and some of the things you're noticing in your schools and community. And so
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. And I just want to put up really quick the slide with there we go, our QR code. So Peel is our main funder here for this program, and we're so grateful and thankful for them. But they need to know what you like about this presentation, what you don't like, and if we should do more of it. So if everybody could just take a moment and scan the QR code or go to the link here on the slide and just fill out a quick survey. And while we're doing that, I'm going to gather a couple of other questions that have come through in the Q&A.
And while those are coming up, Maggie, just my apologies is trying to watch your very fast chat boom up. I missed, I know 90% of what people posted. And so that was not a deliberate ignoring, but just wow, there's a lot coming in. So
yeah, well, we're going to save the chat too, because we had so many great comments and people really sharing, and it was great. I mean, thank you everybody who was participating and sharing. That was great. And we got some good questions here that kind of dovetail with some of the questions I've already prepared. Okay, so let's go. Well, we can leave this evaluation slide up for a little bit. If people want to do that, and I'll just sort of dive into questions, Eric. And it's about 7:28 right now, so we've got a little bit of time here. So we're gonna try to get to as many of these as we can. I thought it was really interesting, and I'm glad that you showed the data for Pennsylvania, because as a Pennsylvanian, it's I think it's kind of sad that we're really in the middle there in terms of how we're including kids. And one of the things I wanted to ask your opinion on, or your reflection on, is in Pennsylvania, we have a lot of school districts that have specialized programs. And so a lot of our students are being segregated because they're going to an autism support program or they're going to a life skills program. And particularly in our elementary schools, a lot of those programs are housed in different buildings, and kids are bused to schools that are not even in their neighborhood or, immediate community. And I just wanted to get sort of your response to that. If we're talking about belonging, I mean, that seems like a huge barrier, right? Just the very basic. We're not even meeting the baseline, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's why we both have presence as an element of belonging, but it's not the only thing. And you know, as I started off, it's just really hard if you're not there to belong to a community. And so I think part of what we think about is what are the missed opportunities with that? What do we miss when that's our dominant model? And you've probably heard other people talk about this. I do a lot of work around the secondary transition end of things, and I would just say it's really hard to prepare people for integrated, inclusive lives in segregated and separate settings. It's just, we're missing an opportunity. Like, how do we teach and prepare students well for an inclusive world that none of our teaching opportunities are in that context? And so that's one of these kind of missed opportunities as we think about the potential thing that we're missing in that. The other is just an observation that's a data-based observation, Maggie, is that it is one of the things we know changes trajectories for students into youth and adulthood is that being included becomes a predictor in school, becomes this predictor of being included later in life, in a workplace, in a neighborhood, in a community. And we often say that the converse of that is true, that early separation or segregation, it also predicts later separation and segregation. And in fact, it's not really a predictive, it almost guarantees it. And so that too is when we're thinking about what is a good education and a flourishing life, we're just already restricting the opportunities for teaching in that. And we can't simulate a real world in a completely different setting. And I'm not trying to characterize every one of us. I don't know the classrooms and the schools that you're in, but those are the general themes. I think that when I think about the negative impacts there, then it becomes partly, it just limits your opportunities to be present and to be known and to be befriended and to be needed. It limits the opportunities to learn from an incredible range of great teachers in your local schools and peers. And I think I would argue that one of the key things is it limits the opportunities for everyone else in that community to come to know those kids. And our peers in the local schools, they grow up and guess what? They become coworkers and they become corporate leaders and congregational leaders and community leaders. And if they are growing up never meeting their peers with disabilities and encountering their strengths and their personalities and their commonalities, how can they lead those communities well? And how can we change attitudes and opportunities if everyone is growing up never encountering them? And I share that. I think, Maggie, you might have put the post earlier. That's what I grew up in. I grew up in a world that, as far as I knew, didn't include people with developmental disabilities. And that's an inadvertent effect that when we think about prioritizing these experiences of students, we're missing out also on the broader storyline of who else is missing out by never getting to meet those students. And I could tell more stories about that, but we'll do that next time around what peers say they would miss out on if they didn't have those opportunities.
And you know, Eric, I can tell you too, as a parent, having not grown up going to school with children with disabilities, then being a new parent to a child with a disability, I was terrified.
Yeah.
And it's and maybe the next generation of parents won't be so scared, right? Because they have the experience. Yeah. So, and this kind of leads into my next question, because I think that these programs exist. What I hear from administrators often is that there are a lot of parents who are asking for them. They want their child in, they don't feel that their child is going to be safe in a general education setting. They're afraid of bullying. They're afraid of not making friends, of not being invited to birthday parties. They feel like if they're with kids who are more like them, they'll have more chances to have friendship. So, I mean, what would you say to parents who maybe are choosing to segregate their kids?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say one starting point, I understand that inclination. If that has been your experience of that inclination towards, I don't want to have my child in a situation where they might be picked on or bullied or excluded. And if that's my perception of a place, you understand that inclination. But I also have to say those can't and shouldn't be the only two options. To either be in an inclusive place where you're picked on or not well supported, or in a separate place where those things don't happen. That is our collective effort to say there's got to be a third way of what we want to advocate for is not two short-sighted or falling short options, but the third is I want my child to have this great opportunity to learn side in general ed classrooms. And I want that to happen without bullying or whatever. And like a school should say, of course, like how could we not be that? So I would say we would not be okay with that with any other student. Here's your two choices. You can either be here and not be bullied, or you can be with everyone else. So that's a charge. That's not the burden of families. That's the reality we have to fight for in schools. And so, but I think from a family perspective, it is thinking about, well, what is the experiences I want my child to have? What do I want them to be able to learn to do? What do I want my child to know? What relationships do I want them to develop? What experiences do I want them to have? And then what's the best place to have all those things? And then let's make sure the supports are in place so that those experiences are meaningful and possible and safe. And we're advocating for that. So I agree. There's nothing inherent about inclusion or a local school that should imply bullying, and where it happens, we need to nip that in different directions, but that can't be part of our equation. That's a failure of our school systems on families as well. So that was a little bit long-winded, but I do want to affirm I get that inclination. And so our charge is how do we make sure that's not the options that we're giving to families? And also for families that you're like, let's also push beyond the perception of those things and the realities of those things too. Because from a history, we often have a fear of it happened once, it could happen here. And so how do we push through those perceptions that it might possibly be the case and instead advocate for the supports to make sure it's not going to be the case?
It also, this happens, I think, in lots of schools across the country, that you have a parent like me, for example, who really pushes hard to have their child included, but it kind of, it might sort of stop with the presence aspect. How do we get schools to recognize that there are all these other dimensions and encourage, it's got to go beyond professional development, right? Like, how do we get them to sort of put those attitudes into place and those practices into place?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I don't, I feel like I can say this between every answer. There's not always an easy recipe kind of thing here, but a couple of things I've noticed. One relates to what I just shared is, and I probably just should have said this earlier, that in talking about these 10 dimensions of belonging, if you pause long enough and think about it, we were never having a conversation about kids with disabilities specifically, right? Those 10 dimensions of belonging I just talked about are what any family member would want for any kid. And I would go further and say that's probably what we saw up on the screen is what any of us want for ourselves. So I think partly there's a strategy there then. If we can invite schools to say, let's reflect on what I think we all agree is important for any student, of belonging. And let's talk about how do we know kids belong and reflect together on who in our school is experiencing those things and who's missing out. What they start to realize is, wow, we assumed that these things were in place for kids with disabilities and they're not. And also what they'll often discover is we assumed these were in place for all of our kids. And there's lots of other kids who don't have disabilities who aren't experiencing these. So I think part of it is how do we introduce the conversations to our school that, and it's often in people's mission statement, that's belonging is important for all the kids. Let's look at whether certain students are missing out from that experience and what can we do to change that narrative. I have found that when I go into schools and when families have gone into schools and the conversation is around inclusion, that often erupts into some sort of debate or argument or advocacy moment or whatever. What I find when people bring up the issue of belonging is it's almost never debated. Like people debate inclusion, but they don't debate belonging. And so that's often my entry point is, let's talk about that. And everyone can affirm on that team that this matters. And now our question is, what can we do in the school to put this child in the best position to belong? And that starts pushing you towards a conversation about inclusion. So I know that's a little bit roundabout, Maggie, and it's just one way, but I do feel like so much of this is we don't have this conversation. We talk about academics, we talk about behavior, and we forget about relationships in that. Teachers are held accountable for academics and others, and they are spend a proportionate amount of time on behavior. But at the end of the day, if all of us on this call started to think about our favorite memories of school or what we got excited about, we would talk about the relationships. And so it's reminding schools that, of course, this was what you valued. This is what you want for kids. Let's make that our entry point. I think that might start some conversations. It's not going to get you to the end, but it opens up some doors. And then, sorry, one last kind of thing on that. For those of you who are school leaders, you might also think that these 10 dimensions of belonging are the things that are going to support your staff, because there are a lot of staff who need to feel welcomed and accepted and supported and heard and befriended and needed. And so there's also this universality of what we're talking about, that it will resonate and it leads your conversations in some new directions. So.
And I just want to comment on one of the things that you said, because I saw you speak years ago. You came to Philadelphia and you spoke at Peak. That was my first experience seeing you. And you had made that comment about, like, you made everybody to raise their hand about what they remembered from school. Was it math class? Was it French class? And it wasn't. It was the time that you spent with your friends and who you ate lunch with and things like that, which is so true.
Yeah, I mean, my apologies to all of you who are English teachers and chemistry teachers. That does get named as relationships with teachers, but the classes start getting named like 12th or 13th on the list. And it's the extracurriculars and the hanging out at the lockers. And actually, Maggie, too, the converse is true. When people think about their most wounding memories, it's often around the opposite of those. And so should cue us into things. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the sort of themes I'm noticing here in the chat is talking about training for staff, right? Some people are saying, maybe part of the problem is we don't have enough trained staff specifically dealing with kids with disabilities. But then at the same time, it also seems like some of this shouldn't require special training, right? I mean, to make someone feel welcome, to make someone feel accepted. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a really great, I find myself doing this all the time. The solution is more training. And there's an element, there's certainly of that. But one of the things that I like about this framework is, and again, we didn't invent this belonging or 10 dimensions or anything. We're just trying to repeat back what the reality of people's experiences is. That when is the way we frame those reflection questions is, if you do sit around in a group and say, well, what could we do to make sure that students are invited or students feel welcomed? We can generate many, 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 many things. And guess what? Almost all or all of those are going to be the same answer for students with disabilities. So at one level, you're right. There's a lot we know that we forget we know. And one of the great strategies that I learned from a colleague who does work in this area was the idea of reversing the question. So when someone says, well, we don't know how to make sure kids with disabilities feel accepted, you just say, well, what do we know about how do you make anyone feel accepted? And that gives you 90% of your answer often. And then it might be some speaking in or training to that last 10%, right? There is some extra things that are helpful to know about supports or about accommodations or about universal design or responsive design that benefit from training. But we can get the first 90% from just being intentional about it that don't require specialized training. And I think that's one of the things that so often is disabling in schools is, even among teachers and staff, it's like, well, I don't have the expertise. I was never trained as a special educator, but you know a lot about belonging for other kids. You know about supports and inviting and befriending, and do those things and we'll teach you the rest. So it is a both and. I think there's a place for, but we can't stop and say, well, we got to wait to promote belonging until someone trains us to do that. That sort of belies what our own knowledge and experience is. I'll point you all in, you'll see in the handout some references to some places that have some good training and free training on those strategies. But let's not let that be the barrier. Let's let that be the supplement to some initial conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so often there's, my child has Down syndrome, for example, and I think there's often this impression, among people who aren't trained to work with a child with Down syndrome that like, I don't know what to do with her. Like, I don't know what to do with a special needs child. And, there was this great video for Down syndrome, World Down Syndrome Day a few years ago, like just sort of debunking that idea that people with intellectual disabilities have special needs. It's like trying to make people recognize, like, they have the same feelings and needs for wanting friends and for feeling accepted as everybody else.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Actually, Maggie, I almost put that video in, but I was like, I don't think I have permission to share that on a, but you're right. So we would often talk about universal needs. Like I might frame like what the 10 things you just saw aren't special needs at all. Like everyone has those needs. Now, there are times when there's some particular individualized or specialized ways we work to meet those needs, but the needs themselves are universal in that sense. And so I think, I don't want to suggest that there's no specialized knowledge or training that's helpful in this, that simply anyone can do this in a sense. But I'll say there's more that we don't need training on that we think. And then second is, that's why we have collaborative teaming in our schools. There are people in your schools who do have that expertise. Sometimes there are parents who bring that deep expertise. So we have to not let the barrier of I don't know how to do this, or I feel uncomfortable or reluctant, and it reveals my lack of expertise or vulnerability, to say, all right, what do I know, and who else in my midst might round out what I don't know? And often that comes from, connections to colleagues, connections to organizations, and sometimes it requires, like, we've got enough people that don't know how to do this, let's bring in some training on this. But I don't want that to be our excuse, is that we haven't had the training. That was fine when I started at this work 30 years ago, maybe, but that can't be our answer 30 years later. We still need to wait for that training component. Yeah.
What role do you think there is for administrators and school board members, you think, in sort of making the shift or a culture change?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important. It makes the difference between a school that tinkers with inclusion or does it for a few kids and one that goes all in. I mean, you all know, as many of you family members, you're fighting for this for your child, but you're fighting up against systemic issues that the school's just not primed and ready for this. And so you can still make movement. That's where you find yourself. You have to still make the movement and advocate for your child, certainly. But it's the school leaders and district leaders who are in the position to make the systemic changes. And so when you're writing a mission statement that says what kids learn is just as important to, that was, I forgot about the gestures with Zoom now, but that what you learn matters as much as who you know and who comes to know you. That relationships aren't a competing priority learning, but they go hand in hand. And we're making that our mission. And we're asking the question, not just are we producing kids who have lots of head knowledge, but are we positioning good kids of character and traits who are relational and can be part of a vibrant, flourishing community? So I think there's a part of like setting that as our mission, and then holding their, like, providing the guidance and training for how to do that, and then having accountability to reflect on. Like, I think it'd be a bold and right of an administrator to say, part of our faculty meeting is each month or each week, we're going to take one of these dimensions of belonging. And as this faculty, reflect on what are we doing well so we can celebrate it, but we need to figure out what we're not doing well and need to do better or different. and lead their school in those conversations and be willing to go where that leads. And I think it also means that our metrics can't just be academics. It can't just be reductions in behavioral disciplines. It has to be in what are we collecting that tells us that kids are flourishing in our school, and part of that flourishing is these relationships. So what are we measuring and what's our accountability? So that's just a little bit of it. And I know, Maggie, in your work and others, that when a school administrator gets this, they can bring people in line. But when it doesn't become part of the culture and that school administrator leaves, it very quickly goes back to what it was. So it's not just about leading well, but making that just calcifying that into the culture, so that you're hiring people based on who values this. You're supporting people in this area, and you are acknowledging and celebrating when they're doing it really well. That's the leader's role, in my view.
That's great. Yeah. You talked about this idea of invitation, and I've heard you talk in other contexts, like in a congregation, making sure to invite people into your church community or whatever. And in a school, everybody, a public school accepts everybody, right? But how do schools really make that invitation more sort of direct, I guess? Or how do they make families feel like, either in a classroom or in a particular school building, that yes, my child is invited to be here. I want them here in this, general education math class, or this, French class, or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking about some of that work. We often will talk about the difference between an invitation and an announcement. So this is one. Like, people will often say, well, of course, we're a public school, everyone can come. And hey, look at our sign. It says everyone's welcome. Our mission statement says that. That's an announcement. That's not an invitation to particular people that I want you here as part of this group. And so I think one is, like, if it's one thing to announce, and you should, that every person belongs here and everyone can be part of anything we offer. It's another to start to notice, well, wait a minute, none of our students with disabilities are in any of our extracurriculars, or none of them are part of the school play or in student government or serving in the school store or on the sports team. And let's go out and actually invite people to consider that. Why do we have field trips and none of our students with disabilities are a part of it, or on the playground? So I think there's a sense that at one level, let's make sure we truly believe everyone should be part of everything. And then how do we as teachers start to think about everything that I lead as a teacher? I'm a club leader, I'm a sponsor for this group. Am I seeking out the kids with disabilities who are so often not part of those, and saying, hey, you know what? I think you'd be really good as part of this drama club. I think you'd be really great as part of, serving on the school project or volunteering on this thing that we're doing for the community. So that's part of it. But I think concretely, I'd make that part of our IEP meeting planning. Like, instead of just planning for what happens in the classroom, part of our conversation, it's actually an IDA. Are we considering extracurriculars? And are we making sure that families know about what the extracurricular offerings are that are school sponsored and beyond? Are we bringing them up at those meetings and saying, not checking off the box that we consider it, but which of these do you think would be great for your son or daughter? And that's a way of inviting people into those experiences. And I've just noticed so often, particularly for kids who have complex communication needs, they aren't able to come home and tell their parent about all the extracurriculars of the clubs. So we have to communicate those to families and say, we'll do what we can to provide the supports in that and plan for that as intentionally. So one of the ordinary simple things, we had some schools that would just develop these books of lists of activities and clubs and programs at their school. And they made sure every parent of a child with disabilities got that and was asked the question, what 2 or 3 things do you think your student would enjoy? And let's work towards getting them part of that. So that's part of what I mean by inviting. In addition to, there's a role of how you kind of prime peers to do that. And peers can't invite someone they've never met. So that's a part of it. How do we get kids to connect around common interests? And then they start to say, hey, I want to hang out with you after school and watch more of these movies, or read more of our comic books, or binge on our Netflix shows that we love. but they don't know to invite if they've never met them, and they perceive they have nothing in common in our interests. So there's a whole element of that part that we have to make sure isn't the barrier to invitations happening.
Yeah, and you're making me think of in my own school, there are families who yeah, I mean, I don't think that the parents feel like they're invited to participate in a lot of the school activities. And, and that's a shame because that's, a barrier to the family and to the student, And someone mentioned here in the chat too that their school, and I think this often happens in scheduling. It's like the support needs of the student are planned during elective times. And those often happen to be the fun classes when the kids are all having fun together and doing cool things. And that seems unfortunate too.
Yeah, and that's a place to go back to your school leadership piece. We were working with a school where that was all the extracurriculars happened after school. And guess what? The special education bus came 30 minutes before school was done. And so that's why there was no one with disabilities who was part of the school clubs. And that leader had to say, wait a minute, this isn't just a barrier for kids with disabilities. It's a barrier for kids in poverty who have to work after school. And they created a block in the middle of their school day. They embedded club activities into that and made it possible for everyone to participate. And that was a leadership role that addressed a structural issue too. And so I think there's, in all of these discussions, we're talking about kids with disabilities, but we're remembering that these issues often arise for other groups of kids too. And sometimes that's joining forces on let's create solutions for lots of kids, often benefits them, the kids with disabilities too. So,
yeah. And you talked about like the acceptance piece, and that really sort of struck me because I often feel like students with disabilities are accepted so long as they're conforming to what we expect in a classroom. They're not they're not causing any behavior issues. They're not, they don't require any extra help with academics or whatever it may be, that if they can sort of fit into the structure that we already have, then yeah, sure, they can belong here. So how do we change that thinking?
Oof, I mean, that's so deeply rooted and so into how many schools are designed is sort of aiming for a narrow group of kids and expecting everyone else to fit in or you're excluded. So I think, when I think about the sort of the roots of that, there's a larger conversation about sort of how we change that piece. And I think we'll come back to a little of that in the third week as well. But this is a place where we have to build, I think, capacity of our schools to have the commitment to serve the breadth of students in their community. And this is whether you're a public school or a private school, in my view, is thinking about who are the breadths of kids in our school, in our community, and making sure we're equipping our educators with both training and guidance around universal design. So we're thinking at the outset proactively that we don't going to have just a narrow range of kids. We're going to have a breadth of kids, some who speak and learn and talk and walk in widely varied ways. So we need to both be equipped for universal design and then also know how to do that more responsive design, to have the skills to be able to individualize and adapt. And so often, because people don't have those capacities, they draw the boundaries in very narrowly. And if you fit, you can be in. And if not, I wouldn't know how to serve you. And off you go to someone else who does. And so that too is one of those kind of structural issues. So that is a place where training can become valuable. Now, as you know, too, we're reinforcing that problem in the way we train teachers, and we train some teachers to work with some students and other teachers so we reinforce that problem, and we need to fix that at a higher ed level. But at the local school level, it's all right, how do I make sure that there are not your students and my students, there's our students, and we need to have the commitment and skills to serve our students in whatever setting works best for them, and not let my capacity as a teacher dictate what you experience as a student. That's the opposite of individualization and special education purpose. Yeah.
That's great. Well, we have come to the end of our 2 hours. This went really fast. I told you it would, Erik. And I knew it would, because you had so many wonderful things to say. And I want to thank you so much. I want to remind everyone that we're going to be sending out a link of the recording, and we will include the handouts that Eric mentioned, and I think the PowerPoint, right,
Yep.
Eric? Yeah.
Yep.
So we'll be able to share that with you, and please come back next week. And we'll do this again. Although we'll dig a little bit deeper next week's. We're going to be talking about peer support arrangements and supporting relationships and learning and inclusive classrooms. I think it's going to be a great discussion, and I can't wait for it. And I'm going to hand it off to Cindy. So I will see everybody next time.
Thanks, Maggie, and huge thanks to Erik Carter. This is why we work so hard as parents, and why we cry, and why we spend our evenings here. I'm going to say it, this is why we fight to have our kids meaningfully included with their typical peers. A lot of times we feel so isolated, and this forum gave us a sense of belonging, that we're not alone and we all belong. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.